It's time for another Barn Buddy on my Pay It Forward quilt, and this time we're going to be talking about row 2 and block 1. Hello, my name is Joanne Knight. Welcome to the barn. For this Barn Buddy, we're going to be talking about some of my design decisions. This is a log cabin type block, so there are lots of ways that you can go to make it as custom as you want or as simple as you would like for it to be. This is a close-up picture of the block. You can see that it's kind of an border corner upper left type setting with a square in the bottom right hand corner, and I could have done each one of these different colors individually, but I thought that was a little bit of overkill even for me. So what I decided to do was find a pattern that would break up some of the geometric lines and some of these straight lines, but at the same time kind of stay true to what the block was. I'd love to tell you that it was really hard on this particular one, but it was nothing more than placing two different patterns in this block and looking at it a little bit different way. So let me show you how I did that. This is a picture of the entire row 2 and what I quilted on that particular row. I kind of like the way that this looks like a heart right here on this block, so I was really pleased the way that that came out. But we're going to focus on this block right here and how I ended up quilting that particular block. So I'm going to take these patterns and I'm going to move them out of the way. They are two individual patterns. You can see that whenever I click on them. And I'm going to make my keypad machine dialog box just a little bit smaller because we don't need that right now. This is what I want to focus on. On each one of these blocks, I did the stitch in the ditch on every single block. Once that stitch in the ditch was done, I then converted that stitch in the ditch to my boundary, because that gave me an exact replica of where those seam lines were on that block. I did these individually. In other words, I would quilt this block, then I would go and do the stitch in the ditch on this next block that I have the patterns highlighted. I would convert the boundary there, and I did that for each individual block in this quilt, because that way I knew that my boundaries were really accurate whenever I started to quilt that block. And I didn't have to click the boundaries again, so that was a time saver. I'm going to select the boundary on this block. I'm going to select my pattern, which is by Kim Diamond. Boundary is selected. Pattern is selected. I have my margins at 0 for this quilt, so that means that every time that I do a pattern to boundary, CreativeStudio is going to fill up that boundary as close as it can do. So I'm going to leave that at 0. I'm going to left click on pattern to boundary, and CreativeStudio is going to place that block in that boundary. Select the block, hit my space bar to rotate it around because I wanted it to be going kind of the opposite direction of what the piecing was in this block. You see that I've got some space on this right side, even though I have a 0 margin, and the reason that I have the space is because of these purls that are in this block. CreativeStudio puts this pattern in here as symmetrically as it can. You notice that this one is really close. This one is closer, and this one's a little bit of a distance off, which means that I may not have done a really good piecing job on this particular quilt. The blocks were not pieced by me, but the entire quilt was, so I'm responsible for these seam lines that make up this boundary. I did adjust it a little bit closer to the boundary lines because I have a tendency to do that. And I also tried to keep in mind this corner and the corner of the seam right there. So I quilted that particular part out. Once I did that part, I took this fringe fan pattern, and this pattern is by Anita Shackelford. You see that right there where it says fringe fan? And you might think that it doesn't really look all that much like the pattern that I used. So let me show you what I did on that one. I'm going to drag this pattern to the screen. My pattern is selected. I'm going to go right down here to my selected pattern properties, and I'm going to type in 45 and move my mouse. That pattern is selected, so I'm going to rotate it around, and I just placed it right in here like this. Make it go a little bit larger, scroll in a little bit. I went to F12 handles. I'm going to use fill, and I don't want this pattern to be cut off at a weird kind of angle, so I'm going to pull this blade out. I want an entire blade in my boundary. I'm going to pull this side. It not only stretches out that pattern a little bit, but it also fills up the space a little bit better. I can give it a little bit more rounded look, and this was just a matter of playing with it and deciding what I want it to be. Keep messing with it, always watching these sides to make sure that I have a complete fan in this side on that boundary, because when I select fill, CreativeStudio is going to chop off the parts of that pattern that I don't need, and I don't want it to be a half a fan blade. I'm okay with it being a portion right here, but not necessarily in this other part. And I'm just going to keep messing with it until it's what I want it to be. And once I get through doing that, my pattern is selected. I have one boundary, and I'm going to left click on fill pattern. My auto view is on, so let's take that off. And now you're going to see how I ended up with that pattern. I'm not real crazy about this line right here, so let's do a Control Z. Thank you very much. I'm going to select the pattern, and that's the good thing. If you don't like the way that that looks, if I just move this little pie piece of that handle right there, what I did was move this curve to the outside of my boundary. And if I move that curve to the outside of my boundary, I don't end up with that pretty arc coming inside on my pattern, and that's what I want to avoid. I just would prefer not to have that in there. If you don't like the way fill acts, and if you don't like the way it fills a particular pattern, then just do Control Z. I need to move this back just a little bit because it is going to quilt over into that little purl, and I don't want it to do that. Now I am going to say fill inside. It should cut off this arc right here, and that's what I want it to do. If you don't like this particular line on this pattern, I can go to nodes and I can pull that to the outside of the boundary. You see how I'm just pulling that to the outside of the boundary? It doesn't have to be something pretty, because CreativeStudio is going to cut off anything that is on the outside of that boundary, because I'm going to tell it to fill inside. So it doesn't bother me that I have this little hoopty right here. That's not a concern. Fill inside. You see how much prettier that is? You see how much nicer that look is on that particular one? So that's what I did on that block, and that's the way that I quilted that one out. It turned out to be a pretty look, and I was really happy with it. And it also gave me that geometric look at the same time with giving me pearls. So that's as easy as that particular block was, and that was my thought process on it. Thank you for coming to the barn. I'll see you next time.